The shovel struck frozen clay with a hollow clang, and it wasn't the sound that made the widow flinch. It was what followed, that sharp, ugly silence that settles in when men stop working just to watch you. Again, from the ridge above her barn, 4 of them sat their horses and stared. No greetings, no offers to help, just arms crossed over winter coats, and that look in their eyes like they were trying to figure out what kind of madness had finally taken hold of her. Her name was Clara Holt, 32 years old, widowed 2 winters ago when a tree split her husband clean down the back during a sleet storm, left her with 3 children and land nobody wanted. 1 barn, no proper house, and not a soul in 6 miles who believed she'd survive another winter, least of all after what she'd done this time, because now she was digging again. Not to bury a chicken, not to fix a fence post, not to plant anything. She was digging right behind the barn, where the snow piled thick and the ground kept freezing again each night. She'd been out there since dawn, shoulders aching, knees blue beneath her skirt. And every time that spade hit clay, she drove it in like she meant to carve a tunnel through the entire earth. And maybe she did, because Clara wasn't building up like the others. She wasn't stacking walls higher or adding chimneys or caulking her doors tighter. No, Clara Holt was going underground. No one in the valley knew why yet, but they would. And by the time they found out, it would be too late for most of them. It had started in November, when the horses refused to cross the ridge and the clouds lay low like dirty wool. That was the year the snow had come early, before the creeks froze, before the hay was even half stacked. A warning, clear as thunder. Clara had seen the signs, the beaver dens higher than usual, the rabbits running south too early, the way the wind stopped moving altogether just after dusk. She remembered the stories her husband used to tell, about the winter of '61, when every man west of Marlow froze to death in his sleep because they trusted their cabins too much. Back then, the survivors were the ones with cellars, caves, or the old root-hollowed wagons tucked underground. And Clara had children, Maggie, aged 10, Toby, 6, and Ruth, barely 2, still sucking her fingers when she was nervous. So, when she found the crawl space beneath the old barn, just a narrow hollow between warped floor beams and frozen dirt, she got to thinking. She laid down on her side with a candle, wriggled in, and measured it all with her breath, and decided she'd dig, not just a cellar, a room, a second world, a place warm enough to hold the last fire on Earth if it had to. No one would see it from the road. No one would know, not until it was needed. She didn't have a choice. When you're alone with 3 little ones and a wind's coming that can snap trees like twigs, you don't ask permission to save them. You just start digging. The digging had to be done at night mostly. Maggie would stand guard near the front porch with a lantern, pretending to mend dresses. Toby would stack buckets inside the barn. Clara wore a sackcloth around her boots to keep the noise of her steps muffled. She dug sideways from beneath the barn wall, moving slow. Every 6 inches forward, she shored up the ceiling with scavenged boards, pieces of broken troughs, old fence posts, crates from the dry goods store. No one noticed what went missing. They were too busy fighting about lumber prices and blaming each other for the thinning supplies. Some nights, the cold bit down so hard she couldn't feel her hands. Her breath froze to the beam just inches from her nose, but she kept at it like a badger tunneling under fire. The room grew slowly, a few feet long, then 6, then 10. By the second week, she'd hollowed a chamber big enough to lie in sideways. She brought down wool blankets, a crate of lard and dried meat, a stack of candles, and one old iron stove that she and Maggie lowered with ropes until it thudded softly into place like a heart dropping into a chest. She didn't tell a soul. Not even the preacher who visited to bring canned pears and quote warnings about preparing your soul more than your shelter. Clara would nod, thank him for the tins, and keep digging once he was gone. The kids helped in ways they didn't understand. Ruth stayed quiet during the long evenings. Toby practiced stuffing cloth in the cracks to block wind. Maggie kept secrets like a stone, tight, silent, unbreakable. Clara told them it was a game, their winter fort, a place only they could find. But deep down, Maggie understood. You could see it in her eyes. She knew her mama was preparing for the kind of cold that didn't knock, it crept. The rumors came before the frost. That widow's gone mad, said the butcher's wife. She's not chopping wood. She's not asking for help. She's, what, building a tunnel? A tunnel. That word made the rounds. Clara heard it whispered behind her back at the trading post, heard it spit out like a joke at the well. One man joked she was digging her own grave to save time. They didn't understand. They never asked why she didn't join them in the town's new warming hall project, or why she passed on the lumber co-op's offer to build her a proper house for the winter. She had her reasons, mainly that the barn kept her animals alive, and the ground beneath it was the only thing solid enough to hide her children from what was coming. Still, it stung. Worse, it threatened to expose her work. One neighbor even came by offering help, poking around, glancing too long at the barn. Clara had to slam the door with Ruth in her arms, and pretend the baby was sick just to keep him out. But she didn't stop. If anything, she dug faster, harder, because by then, the wind had changed. It blew dry, bone-sharp, with no scent of moisture. The sky stayed a bruised yellow all day. Something was building in the mountains. The animals knew it too. Her goats huddled without reason. The hens stopped laying. And on the 3rd day of December, just after sunrise, the sky turned to steel, and the snow came screaming sideways. The blizzard didn't start like others. There was no soft warning, no powder drifting in quiet swirls across the fence posts. It came like a sheet of white violence, wind slamming into roofs, snow flung so hard it cracked glass. The entire valley vanished beneath it in under an hour. People who'd spent decades in those mountains panicked. Men tried to reinforce walls with hay bales. Women rushed to heat stones and boil water before the firewood dampened. But Clara didn't run around. She didn't cry or scream or pray. She took one last armload of kindling, opened the trapdoor hidden beneath the goat pens, and told her children to climb down. They didn't argue. Maggie held Ruth. Toby went first, sliding into the dark like he'd done it 100 times. Clara followed last, pulling the hatch shut behind her just as the storm hit the barn full on and sent the goats into a frenzy of cries. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it wasn't death. The fire kindled quickly. The chimney, a long pipe angled out through the back wall, began to hum with heat. Clara rolled out the quilts, wrapped her baby in wool, and listened to the storm claw at the barn boards above. They were safe, for now. She didn't cry, but something in her chest went tight, and for the first time in weeks, her hands stopped shaking. It was only on the 2nd night, as the storm kept on without letting up, that Clara realized no other fires were visible. Not from the ridge, not from the distant barns, not even from the town below. She moved the stovepipe slightly to peer out through a crack in the boards, just enough to catch a glimpse through the snow-drenched dark. Nothing. No lanterns, no movement, no voices, just the sound of the world being buried, and the bitter knowing in her bones that the others hadn't prepared. Not really. They had mocked her, yes, but Clara had dug deeper than any of them had dared. And now, her children were warm. By the 3rd day, the snow had buried the barn to its roofline. What had once been a proud slope of boards now looked like a lump beneath a white shroud. From inside the hidden room, Clara and her children listened as the storm continued to scream across the land above them, like it had no intention of stopping. Not this week, maybe not even this month. The wind didn't howl, it hunted, it found cracks in wood, dug claws into shutters, and pressed its full weight against anything standing tall. But underground, the wind couldn't reach them, not through packed earth and beams pressed tight with rags and pine sap. In that dark chamber, no taller than a man's chest and no longer than a wagon, Clara built warmth, one breath, one flame, one prayerless night at a time. The stove glowed low, steady. The iron pipe sucked just enough air to keep the smoke moving, hidden by a drift and shaded by brush. It had taken her weeks to test the draft angle, and every minute had been worth it. She rationed light carefully, no more than 2 candles burning at a time. The flames cast a soft golden haze that made Ruth's cheeks look like baked apples. Maggie's hair shined darker than coal, and Toby's hands danced with shadows as he played with the few carved figures he'd brought below. The children didn't ask to go up, not anymore. They could hear what waited above. At dawn of the 4th day, Clara used her palm to clear a smear of frost off the narrow observation slit behind the stovepipe's bend. She squinted through it, blinking against the blinding white that reflected even the smallest shard of light. There was nothing, no figures moving, no plumes of smoke, no firelight glow behind frosted windows, just silence, the kind of silence that weighs more than noise. She closed the flap again and sat by the stove, pulling Ruth onto her lap. The toddler didn't cry. She barely even stirred anymore, just curled herself close and sucked her thumb, her other hand wrapped into Clara's braid like she was holding onto a root in a storm. Maggie sat at the edge of the bedding, carving another figure from a leftover pine stick. She'd made a whole little family now. 2 goats, a woman, a child, even a hen. She didn't talk much, but her hands were always busy, and her eyes never left her mother's face for long. Toby kept track of time. Each day he scratched a mark onto the wooden brace nearest the stove. He'd already counted 4. 5, he said quietly that morning. We've been under 5. Clara only nodded. She didn't have the heart to tell him it had actually been closer to 6. That night they heard it. Not the wind, not the creak of wood. A voice. Muffled, faint, a man's voice, calling something across the snow. Pausing, calling again. Clara froze. Maggie's carving dropped. The sound came again, nearer, ragged, desperate. Then a knock, not at their hatch, at the barn door above. Bang, bang, bang. Hello? A man. The voice of someone barely keeping his lungs steady. Clara felt her pulse spike. She moved to the edge of the underground room and pressed her ear to the beam. More pounding, then silence, then coughing, then collapsing. The thud of it was soft but unmistakable. Flesh hitting wood, snow falling off heavy boots, then nothing more. No more calls, no more knocks, just the storm howling. It took Clara nearly an hour to convince herself not to open the hatch. She sat by the hidden ladder, both hands gripping the frame, her breath hard and tight in her throat. Every instinct she had as a mother, as a human, screamed to go up, to help. But something deeper, older, told her to wait. "Ma," Maggie whispered, her voice as fragile as the candle flame beside her. "Was that Mr. Anders?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't want to say it might have been, and she didn't want to say he was likely already gone. The next morning Clara did go up, but only barely. She eased the hatch open just enough to peek through the slats. The barn was nearly pitch black, snow packed against every wall, cold coiled around her neck like a noose. She looked toward the door. There, slumped against the inside frame, lay a man half buried in white. She recognized him only by the coat, Anders's long brown duster, now glazed over in frost. His face was turned away. His hand had scratched a line across the wall beside him, as though he'd tried to write something. Clara closed the hatch again. She didn't tell the children. She just went back to the fire and added another pine knot to the flames. Over the next days, others came. Not to their door, no one knew it was there, but to the barn. 3 figures on day 8, their outlines ghost-like through the snowstorm, staggering past the fence and vanishing down toward the creek. A woman on day 9, dragging a sled piled with what might have been children, or bundles, or both. She never reached the barn. She just dropped to her knees near the woodpile and didn't move again. Day 10, a dog, mangy, wild-eyed, trying to claw through the barn wall with frostbitten paws. The world had turned silent above, but it wasn't dead. It was just waiting. Clara stopped checking after that. She couldn't afford the weakness. Food ran low on the 11th day. She hadn't packed enough for 3 weeks, not when she'd started digging. She'd expected at most to use the room in bursts, to duck below when the cold peaked and come back up by midday. But this was unrelenting. Each child got half their normal portion. Clara took only the broth from boiled beans. The lard tin grew thin. The dried apples were gone by day 12. Maggie offered to go above. "I can get the hens' feed," she whispered. "But there's grain. It's dry still. I can go, Ma. I know the path." But Clara shook her head. No light shone yet. No thaw had come. If Maggie went up and the hatch froze, or the snow sealed behind her, they'd be split, alone. That night, Clara told them a story, an old Comanche tale her husband had once told by firelight, about a woman who turned herself into stone so her children could hide beneath her during the fire wind. She didn't say it was true, but she held them tighter, and she whispered, "We stay together, we stay low." By day 14, the stove was burning nearly the last of the wood. The heat lingered only in the center of the room now. Ice crawled across the edges of the beams, reaching like fingers. The children no longer played. Even Toby sat still. Clara made a decision. The next morning, while the children slept, she climbed out, only long enough to break open the rear side of the barn, slip through a panel she'd left loose, and dig through the snowdrift to reach the dried corn stalks stored by the fence. Her gloves were torn within minutes. Her fingers burned, but she worked anyway, dragging armfuls of brittle stalks into the barn. She saw Anders again, still there, still frozen. She didn't speak to him. Back underground, she fed the stalks into the stove like a fevered priest tending a dying altar. The warmth came back slowly, but it wouldn't last. On the 17th day, the sound changed. It was subtle, not the wind dying, but shifting. The pitch of it less sharp, less angry. A stillness between gusts, a hush not caused by snow, but by the sky. Clara rose before dawn, climbed the ladder, and lifted the hatch. Light, real light. The clouds had cracked. Blue glinted above, pale and bruised, but visible. And in the silence, she could hear something else. Voices, far off, sobbing. She followed it with her ears toward the town. Someone had survived, but not many, not most. That afternoon, Clara opened the barn door for the first time in over 2 weeks. She stepped out into a valley she barely recognized. Snow above her hips. Half the cabins sagged, roofs caved in, chimneys broken. A single smoke plume rose in the distance, barely strong enough to mean life. She turned and looked back at her barn, its walls frostbitten, the roof bowed but holding. Then she looked at the ground and smiled, because no one had known what she'd built beneath it. No one had understood why. But her children had lived, and the world would hear about it soon enough. The wind was quiet now, not gone, just tamed, like some great beast that had gorged itself on chaos and settled back into slumber. And standing outside the barn in the weak light of morning, Clara Holt felt the ache of those 17 days buried under snow start to move through her bones like thaw water under old ice. She breathed in once, sharp, so dry, metallic, the kind of air that scraped at your throat and left you coughing without knowing why. The sun hadn't yet melted much, but it had done enough to reveal the edges of disaster, and now the town had begun to emerge, or what was left of it. Clara didn't take the children out, not yet. They were still bundled beneath the barn, sleeping near the fire like fox kits curled in moss. Ruth had started murmuring in her sleep again, little huffs and sighs that made Clara's chest twist each time. She wasn't sick, just cold, deeper than the skin. It would take time. Clara knew better than to wake them for what came next, because what came next was the reckoning. She walked slow. The snow was past her knees in the lower valley and frozen stiff along the ridgelines where wind had scoured it thin. Her boots cracked the crust. Left long dents behind. She wore 3 layers, barncoat, scarf, apron, but it still wasn't enough. Cold found its way into everything, even your thoughts. It took her nearly an hour to reach the edge of town. And when she did, Clara stopped and stared. It looked like war had rolled through, fences smashed under snowdrifts, a lean-to collapsed flat. One house, Old Man Whitaker's, burned black down to the joists, chimney crumbling sideways into the ash. Clara could still see smoke rising from the spot, but no footprints nearby, just a scorched shape, as if someone had lit their last match and given up. Other cabins stood, but barely, windows spidered with frost. Doors blown open, snow piled halfway up porches. A few had shutters still nailed in place, which meant people might still be inside, or they might be dead. She moved past them, quiet, listening. No laughter, no hammering, no animals, just the wind and the sound of her own boots pressing down on the frozen crust of snow. At the far end of the valley, the church bell hung still on its frame, coated in ice. The steeple had held, somehow, but the parsonage next to it had its roof buckled inward. The front door hung open, banging softly every few seconds, like it couldn't decide whether to shut or surrender. Clara went inside. She found 2 bodies in the corner, curled together beneath a quilt that had already stiffened. The preacher's wife and daughter, eyes closed, mouths slack. They hadn't starved. They'd just run out of heat. The fire had long gone cold. Clara knelt beside them, placed a gloved hand on the girl's cheek, still soft, but gone. She didn't cry. She didn't even whisper a prayer. Just pulled the quilt back up to cover their shoulders, stood, and backed out the door. Outside, she turned and scanned the ridgeline beyond the town. She knew then what she had to do, because if anyone was still alive, they wouldn't stay that way for long. She returned home before nightfall. The barn was exactly as she'd left it, but her breath caught when she saw the smoke, not from her own pipe, but from the east ridge, curling thin and grey against the sky like someone waving a final signal. Someone was out there. Someone else had survived. "Maggie," she said as she descended into the underground room. "I need your help." The girl sat up at once, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What is it?" Clara squatted beside her, one hand on the child's shoulder. "I need you to stay with your brother and sister. Keep the fire going. Don't open the hatch for anyone but me. You understand?" Maggie hesitated. "You're going out?" Clara nodded. "I won't be long." She handed Maggie the long knife from the drawer beside the stove, the one her husband had carried during the war. Maggie's hand trembled as she took it, but she didn't argue. That night, Clara strapped on snowshoes she hadn't used since before the children were born, wrapped her face in linen, and set out across the valley toward the east ridge. The snow was deeper than it looked. She had to crawl up parts of the slope, using her elbows, dragging herself forward like a soldier through mud. The smoke was faint, barely visible in the moonlight, but it was enough to keep her moving. She reached the crest just before midnight. Below, nestled in a hollow behind a thicket of pines, was a dugout cabin half buried in drift. A lantern flickered behind a thick sheet of oiled paper over the window. She approached slow, calling out only when she was within 10 paces. "Hello? Anyone alive in there?" There was no answer. She tried again. Then the door opened a crack, and a boy's face stared back at her, sunken, pale, wide-eyed. Clara blinked. She knew him. "Eli Turnbow?" she said. "Is your pa here?" The boy nodded, but it was shaky. "He's sick, real bad. We ain't got wood, ain't got much else neither." Clara stepped forward, and he let her in. There were 3 of them inside. Eli, his father, Micah, burning with fever on a pile of quilts, and Eli's younger sister, Rose, who looked barely old enough to stand. Her skin was waxy, her lips cracked. Clara didn't hesitate. She stoked the fire with the last of their kindling. Boiled snow forced warm broth down their throats from the tin can she carried. Micah moaned but didn't wake. Rose vomited twice, but finally drank. Clara spent the rest of the night sitting upright by the fire, dragging in pine boughs and dry hay from the lean-to outside. She wrapped Rose in her own scarf and held the child against her chest until the girl's shivering slowed. By dawn, Micah opened his eyes. "You're the widow," he rasped. Clara nodded. "I thought you were dead." "No," she said. brushing snow from her coat. But most of the valley is. He didn't argue, just turned his head and wept. By the third day after the thaw, Clara had returned to the barn twice, each time bringing food, blankets, spare kindling, a flask of spirits. The Turnbows began to recover. Word spread, slowly, like smoke through wet logs. Till a boy from the North Ridge limped into the valley, half frozen, looking for his uncle. A pair of twins were found in the ruins of a collapsed cabin, alive under a table, their mother gone. One by one, the survivors crept back into the light, and each time they asked, "How did you make it?" Clara didn't boast. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just pointed to the barn and said, "I went low." Then one morning, after the worst had passed, a delegation came, 3 men and 2 women, wrapped in blankets, faces drawn, eyes dark. They stopped at the barn door and waited. Clara met them outside, arms crossed, Maggie behind her, Toby watching from the loft. The first man, John Harper, who once said her roof looked like it was made by a blind mule, stepped forward. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, then at the ground. Then he said, "Oh, we heard you had space beneath." Clara didn't nod, didn't smile, just said, "There's space for children, not pride." He bowed his head. One of the women burst into tears, and Clara opened the door. That night, 12 people slept in the hollow under her barn. The stove glowed, the wind stayed quiet, and Maggie sat up by the fire, watching over them all with the knife still clutched in her lap. They'd mocked her mother, laughed at her, said she was mad, but now, buried beneath the snow and shielded by nothing but grit, timber, and the stubborn will of a mother, they lived, because she had gone low when others went high. And that was the difference. That was the secret. Snow still clung to the valley floor, but the wind no longer bit with teeth. By mid-February, the sun began to linger a few minutes longer each day, and icicles dripped in time with the slow thaw of people who hadn't spoken in weeks. Every step in the softening snow made a sound again, a crunch, a snap, a groan from old boards beginning to dry out. But under the barn, the quiet remained sacred. Clara's hollow had become a lifeboat. 12 slept there now. 6 children, not her own. An old woman who couldn't make it back up the slope. And 2 widowers, one barely able to speak since the storm, the other muttering to himself in the corner, like he was still in that wind. Clara rationed warmth like it was oil. She managed 2 fires, one in the stove below and one in the rebuilt hearth inside the barn's hayloft, where Maggie and Toby had begun moving supplies. Every ember was counted, every scrap of wood treated like a currency more valuable than gold. But it wasn't just survival anymore. It was rebuilding, and for that, Clara knew, warmth wasn't enough. People needed meaning again. It was Maggie who suggested it first, quietly, while wrapping a blanket around Ruth's feet. "We should teach 'em something," she said. Clara looked up from her sewing. "Teach who what?" Maggie shrugged. "The others? The kids? Some of 'em can't even read. Eli's sister, Rose, she don't even know how to count past 10. Clara blinked, then she smiled. By the next morning, they'd scraped soot onto a flat board and propped it beside the stove like a chalk slate. Maggie stood before it, cheeks still red from the cold, hair pulled back, and began showing Rose and Toby how to spell their names with blunt charcoal ends. They laughed, they fought, they got it wrong, but they kept going. Clara sat in the corner, watching, stitching a torn sleeve, tears welling at the corners of her eyes, not from grief this time, but from something stranger, hope. News began to trickle in from other valleys as the roads slowly reopened. First came a traveler from east of Whitley's Gap, snowblind in one eye, half-starved but talking. He said the storm had reached as far south as Clearford and wiped out 3 whole farms before anyone had time to blink. Then came a rider from across the pass, bringing tobacco and news of families gone missing, cabins turned into drift coffins. But the rider also carried something else, a letter from the governor's office in Albany, a call for tallies. How many survived, it read. How many dead? How many children left alone? Clara stared at it in her hands, like it had come from another planet. Then she wrote her reply. 17 here, alive, 1 newborn. No deaths since the storm. Firewood low, food low, morale holding. She sealed it with her name. Clara Holt, widow, South Ridge. Then she hesitated, and under her name, she added something she had never written before. Shelter built beneath barn, kept children alive. Recommend study. By early March, other widows came. The first rode in on a mule, wrapped in rugs, with 3 boys trailing behind her like ghosts. Then 2 more came the next week, carrying only what they could haul in a wheelbarrow. Dried squash, smoked squirrel, boots too big for the children wearing them. Clara gave them space, not just in the hollow, but above, in the barn proper, where Maggie had begun organizing blankets and crates into rooms. They used ropes to hang up quilts for privacy, straw mattresses made from barn hay, everything repurposed. The men who had mocked her stayed silent now. They came with their hats in hand, offering to split wood, haul water, tend goats. They didn't talk about what they'd said last fall. They didn't apologize. They didn't need to. Their faces said enough. One of them, Jacob Green, had lost 2 children in the blizzard. His wife didn't make it either. He showed up one morning and just stood outside the barn for an hour before finally saying, "I'll build you a second hatch if you show me how you made the first one so tight." Clara nodded. She handed him the hammer. That spring, a meeting was called, not in the old town hall. It had collapsed, but on Clara's property, inside the barn, beneath beams still stained with soot and frost. 15 families came, only 9 of them whole. The others were missing someone, a mother, a child, a brother who'd gone out for firewood and never returned. They sat on barrels, crates, the ground, and they listened as Clara stood at the front, Maggie at her side, and told them everything. How she'd dug, how she'd lined the walls, how she'd known the storm was different, and how she'd refused to listen when the laughter came. "You all built higher," she said, "thicker walls, taller chimneys, but the wind don't care how proud a man builds. The only thing that mattered this time was how deep you were willing to go." No one interrupted, not even the preacher. After a long silence, one woman raised her hand. "Will you help us build them?" she asked. "Not for you," Clara replied, "but I'll help you build your own." By midsummer, there were 8 underground shelters in the valley. Not fancy, not spacious, just warm, hidden, smart. They called them Holt Rooms, named not by Clara herself, she never would have allowed it, but by the children who had once sat shivering in a hole and now played tag around the goat pens. And every time someone asked how the first one was built, Clara pointed to her barn and said, "I didn't build it to be remembered. I built it so my children wouldn't be, because the dead are remembered, but the living, they carry the story forward." And yet the past did not leave quietly, not for Clara, because that April, as the snow finally melted from the high ridges and the spring rains turned paths to rivers, she received a letter from the office in Albany again. This time it was personal, not a form, not a tally, but a request, an invitation. "Come share your story. We are gathering reports from survivors. We want to know how it was done. We want to know how it worked." Clara stared at the page. Her hands didn't shake, but her heart did, because she wasn't sure she wanted to be known. She had never asked to be anything more than a mother trying to outlast a storm. That night she sat with Maggie on the barn roof, wrapped in quilts, watching the stars. "What would you do?" she asked softly. Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked down at the valley, at the firelight flickering in new windows, at the barn shadows swaying gently in the breeze. "I think," she said finally, "you should tell them, but not for their sake." Clara looked sideways. "Then for who?" "For the next mother," Maggie whispered. "The one who digs, and they laugh." Summer came with the sound of hammers. Clara sat on the porch of her barn most mornings now, mending clothes or breaking kindling into tighter bundles, while Ruth toddled barefoot in the dirt nearby. Children shouted in the background, healthy, loud, quarrelsome again. Not one of them whispered any more when they laughed. The valley was alive again. Across the fields, the scars of winter lingered. Fallen trees, collapsed fences, broken sheds still half swallowed by old snowdrifts that took the longest to leave. But what rose in their place wasn't grief, it was determination. Every home now had a Holt room. Some were better crafted than hers. Some had real stone linings, ventilation shafts, reinforced beams, even dry shelves for food. One family had gone so far as to build theirs beneath their floorboards like a second house underground. They invited Clara to see it. She walked through it quiet, trailing a hand along the wood, and said only, "Good, but make sure the pipe draft never faces west. That wins faster than death." People listened to her now, but that wasn't the reward. The reward was the children, dozens of them, who woke warm every morning, who didn't know what it meant to bury a parent in the snow. By June, the frost line had pulled back beyond the creek, and the first caravan rolled in from east of the ridge. It brought supplies, letters, men with maps, and one woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as Miriam Callow from the Bureau of Agricultural Settlements. She wore spectacles and a wide hat and had never known cold deeper than her coat, but she listened, sat with Clara by the barn for hours, taking notes, sketching diagrams, asking questions no one else had thought to ask before. How did you insulate with no tar? How deep was the frost penetration? What materials were used for sealing the entryway? Clara answered them all, slow and patient. Then, near the end of their conversation, Miriam asked one final question. What made you decide to build downward? Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out across the fields, at the saplings bending in the wind, the half-mended fence line, the chicken coop rebuilt from old sled runners, and she breathed once through her nose. Then she said, "Because I watched a fire burn sideways once, through a town. It didn't burn up or down. moon. It moved across, and I figured if fire could move like that, maybe cold could too. Miriam didn't speak for a moment. Then she nodded. Would you mind if I shared your story? Others could learn from it. Clara didn't look at her. Only if you tell it right. A week later, she received a package, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. Inside, a pamphlet, printed on cheap paper. Simple ink. It read, Underground Sanctuaries, the Holt Method of Survival Shelter Construction. There were sketches, diagrams, measurements, and a story. Not her whole life, just the part that mattered. The part where a mother saw the sky turn yellow in November and started digging like her children's lives depended on it, because they had. By the following winter, people from 3 counties had visited the valley to see the shelters. Some arrived curious, others skeptical. A few laughed, quietly, with the same tone the men had used the year before. But no one laughed for long, not after stepping into the warm, dry dark beneath a barn, while the wind screamed harmlessly above. Not after seeing the names carved into the walls by children who should have frozen. Names like Maggie, Toby, Rose, and beneath them, carved by hand with the back edge of a knife, we stayed because she dug. That winter, the snow came late, but hard. Another blizzard, nearly as brutal as the last. But this time, no one died in the valley. Not a single one. Because when the wind rose and the sky turned white, families didn't run, they didn't panic, they went below, together, and waited out the storm in rooms no one had believed in, until they had to. Clara stood alone one night in early December, outside the barn. Snow drifted down soft and slow, as if the sky had finally forgiven the land. Inside, her children slept. The hollow room below was quieter than it had ever been, warm, dry, lined with new planks and quilted walls. Maggie had painted a mural with soot and flour paste. Little houses, trees, and a giant wind with a face like a wolf's, turned away by a mother's outstretched hand. It wasn't art, but it was truth. Clara looked up at the stars. She thought of her husband, buried up on the ridge, of the preacher's daughter, of Anders who had died just outside her door, of all the ones who hadn't made it. Then she turned, pulled the barn door shut behind her, and climbed down into the shelter she had once dug in silence while they all laughed. And she smiled, because now no one laughed. They listened, they learned, and they lived.